So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and welcome to the virtual reading group for the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Pleased to be with you guys again. Today we continue reading through the new collection of essays, Thinking Without a Banister, edited by Jerome Cohn. And as I've said before, a number of the essays in this volume are new. Some are earlier versions of later published drafts. And a lot of them are of the kind we read for today, shorter exchanges. So today we suggested that you read 4 short essays or exchanges, and I apologize they were sent out late. I'd like everyone to also welcome Craig Rothstein, who just started the Arendt Center this week. We've trying to get everyone settled back again, and he's going to be taking over from Dan in running the virtual reading group, so you'll all have a chance to interact with him. So the 4 essays that we are discussing today are Politics and Crime, which is an exchange of letters between Arendt and Hans Magnus Enzensberger, a really wonderful German poet and critic. The Crisis Character of Modern Society, which was given in a conference sponsored by Christianity in Crisis magazine. The Possessed, a review of Dostoyevsky's The Possessed, and then this conversation organized by the Rockefeller Foundation, Values in Contemporary Society. The four exchanges or short essays are quite different in their theme, but one idea comes up repeatedly in them, and that's the question that we could call the what is to be done question, the Lenin question, although Arendt's approach to the Lenin question is very different from Lenin. And it's one that I find incredibly compelling, but I think is also quite frustrating to many people. Her answer, in some sense, is we talk about it. In the values and in contemporary society essay on page 440, she says, what Socrates apparently believed was talking about justice makes a man more just. And in talking about courage, even if you don't find any nice definition of what courage is, you may inspire men at a given moment to be courageous. So we create an atmosphere in which we have a chance, at least, to meet the problems and understand them as they come along. This is also the theme of the essay, or the short talk, The Crisis Character in Modern Society. Again, just as in the first one, the Rockefeller Foundation brings some people together and says, we have a crisis in values, what do we do about it? And Arendt is resisting the idea of, well, we define new values. Here in The Crisis Character, she says, yes, there's a crisis. We need new rules, we need new guides. But she says we have to take seriously that the rules and the guides are gone and they're not coming back anytime soon. That doesn't mean they won't come back, and I think that's an important caveat. She does say that it's very likely that they will come back. So on page 330, in the last full paragraph, she does write, I personally do not doubt that from the turmoil of being confronted with reality, without the help of precedent, that is, of tradition and authority, there will finally arise some new code of conduct. So there is a hope, and I would say more than a hope, she says, I do not doubt, that a new code of conduct, new rules, new general principles, new traditions will emerge. But she doesn't think we can impose them. She doesn't think we can make them. We don't have that power of God. Those things happen Well, they happen slowly and gradually over long periods of time. Um, one of the great metaphors for this is by the German um, legal thinker Rudolf von Jhering, who has a great metaphor for how customs and laws emerge. And he says people, walk across a field over years and generations, and they walk all over the place. But over time, enough people take one path that the grass gets beaten down and beaten down and beaten down and beaten down until no grass grows on that path. And he says the emergence of customs are like that. They take generations of people walking the same path, holding the same beliefs, until those customs gain the force of tradition and law and come to be believed as true. And so Arendt, in this essay, The Crisis Character of Modern Society, which is in a way we could say the theoretical announcement of, and the thing that will hold all four of these essays together. Let me just walk you through this essay as a way of, I think, laying out the argument she's making in these texts, and then we can talk about all four texts. So she begins this talk, which we have now published as an essay, saying that there's a hope of the people who brought us together in this small symposium that we will find guidance, new rules to deal with the crisis of modern politics, and that these new rules will give us answers to the question what we should do in Vietnam, how we should deal with the United Nations, and the significance of racial unrest and how to deal with the race problem in the United States. These are the problems of the moment. One would think that in order to deal with these particular or specific problems, we should have general rules, principles, moral guidelines that would guide us. And she says that's natural. But she says, while I certainly share these hopes, I don't think this will be the case. And she says, I don't think this colloquium would be a failure if we don't reach these new general rules. In fact, it's a simple fact, she says at the end of the second paragraph, that there are no general standards to determine our judgments unfailingly, no general rules under which to subsume the particular cases with any degree of certainty. Now, this is not an absolute statement. There are times in history, in fact, I would argue, and I think she has argued, that most periods in history have general rules that give us guidance in how to subsume and understand the particular problems of our time. But the crisis that we are suffering, which she says is defined as a breakdown of such rules and standards, has made it such that there are no general rules. There are no what we used to call eternal verities. And what's important to understand is by eternal verities, she means things that have been beaten down a path through the cornfield, as I was talking about before, for long enough that they become the world in which we live, the ground on which we walk, the sky above us, and they become truths, eternal verities. They're not from reason. They're from the acquired habitual belief in certain principles that over time becomes standard. And we no longer have that. We live in an age in which those eternal verities for us have been lost. She says that doesn't mean they've ceased to exist, that the past doesn't exist, but it has lost its unquestioned validity. And for better or worse, there is a break in the tradition, the loss of general standards, and this cannot be undone. She gives the example, which she uses in a couple of other essays and talks as well, of Winston Churchill's speech in which he says, scarcely anything materially established which I was brought up to believe was permanent and vital has lasted. Everything I was sure or was taught to be sure was impossible and has happened. If I remember correctly, I didn't look it up, but this was given around 1911. Someone can check that for me if you want. And Arendt takes this which happened before the First World War, even, again, if I remember it correctly, as opening up the period of the 20th century in which the old traditions, the certainties that we had of what was right and wrong, everything from which side of the plate to put your knife on, to how you dress and whether you tuck in your shirt, to whether you wear a tie, to whether you can lie, and to whether you can use nuclear bombs, and everything in between. The general standards, the certainties, the truths have disappeared. And even though that has happened, she says, the trouble is that we still want general rules. We still want to subsume individual problems and cases, whether it be Vietnam or racism, under general rules and look to those rules for guidance. And yet we can't. And if we do, it's dangerous. And so she says what we now have are negative standards. This is the bottom of 329 to 330. We know that totalitarianism, communism, appeasement, racism, these are now negative standards. They're what she calls absolute negatives or negative absolutes. But what we no longer have are positive absolutes. In another essay of hers, The Break in Tradition, or the Loss of Tradition, she says that we now only know what we're fighting against. We no longer know what we're fighting for. And this is another way of expressing this same thought. We started with the question, what is to be done? Well, we know what we don't want. We don't want totalitarianism. We don't want racism. We don't want, war. We don't want communism. We don't want appeasement. But we don't know what we want. We don't have any kind of widespread agreement on norms, values, and general rules. And that's the situation that she says we have to confront. Moral truths, and this is part of her basic, you want to call it post-moralism or post-metaphysics approach. She says moral truths resemble the validity of agreements rather than the compelling validity of scientific statements. She thinks that over the history of the world, we come up with moral truths. She's not an anti-moralist. But moral truths come from agreement forged in time over generations. And yet there are times when those moral truths break down, and we are in one of them. And the question is, how can they be restored? And as she said, and I said earlier, she does not doubt that they can be, but she does doubt that we can just pick some and restore them. And so she says, the only way we can restore them is by talking about them. She says on page 331, Augustine once said that things incomprehensible must be so investigated that one should never think he has found nothing when he has found out how incomprehensible they are. Because the one who asks these questions becomes better and better at questioning. So her answer as to what is to be done is talk about the incomprehensible. Another way of putting this is reconcile ourselves to the irreconcilability of the world, or reconcile ourselves to the break in tradition. We have to come to grips with the fact that we live at a time in which eternal verities no longer exist for us. There are no widespread agreements. The break in the tradition that we live in, which was the Roman, Greek, Christian, Judeo-Christian, if you want to put it, tradition, has been broken. And she says the final break was the Holocaust, which showed beyond a matter of a doubt in her mind that there was simply no moral truth that was agreed upon by society. And in the break of this, all we can do is try and comprehend the incomprehensibility of our world. This is another way of doing what the title of this book asks us to do, which is to think without banisters. Banisters for her are the moral verities. And what she says in a number of places is, throughout history, most people have moral verities. Most people have banisters. And those banisters are what we call guides that tell us how to address particular problems, how to deal with Vietnam, how to deal with racism, how to deal with genocide. And we are living in a time without those banisters. And yet she says, okay, that happens too. There have been plenty of times in history when those banisters have broken, have fallen away. And we need to talk and think together. And by talking and thinking about the unprecedented, and by making decisions within that, because we must. So we talk about racism, we talk about sexism, we talk about Syria, we talk about the conflicts of our world, and we make decisions. Do we publish this essay? Do we invite this person to talk? Do we make racial preferences? Do we fire people for publishing articles about Me Too? All sorts of things. And in making these decisions and talking about it, we will, she says, I quote, become better able to deal with the underlying crisis, even if we fail to define it, and will eventually lay the groundwork for new agreements between ourselves as well as between the nations of the earth, which then might become customs, rules, standards that again will be frozen into what is called morality. The only condition for progress in such matters, even though I hate the word progress, is that we are and remain aware that our problems are unprecedented and that we do indeed live in a situation of crisis. And I take this to be one of the really core ideas of Arendt's thinking, which she doesn't articulate in any of her major texts clearly, but in these 4 essays that we're reading today come out, I think, quite clearly, that we have to talk about our problems, talk about our disagreements at a time when we don't have the guideposts, the banisters, the moral verities. And out of that talking, serious talking, where we take seriously the fact that we disagree and that there aren't truths, over time, and it may be decades, it may be generations, it may be centuries, new truths will emerge, but it's going to take time. Now, I find that quite optimistic. Some of you might find, oh my God, that's really pessimistic. Centuries? Generations? But one of the things that reading Arendt and people like her over the years has taught me is to be suspicious of quick fixes. Be suspicious of those who say, I have a theory. That brings us to the possessed, the worry that she has about ideas, modern ideas, which she ends up calling shallow ideas that lead to destruction. But maybe I'll stop there and I can address these questions as we do so through your questions and move on. So let me take a look at some of the questions that have already popped up. See, there's some, and see what we can do. Bob writes, Arendt refers to Socrates and Augustine, and I read that, saying, though we cannot define goodness or beauty and have difficulty in persuading men of our opinion in these matters, we become more just and more pious by thinking and talking about justice and piety. I wish this were true, double exclamation points. Does this thesis hold water in society? Well, that I think is the question she's putting on the table. I'll give you 2 examples that to me are meaningful. And I'd love to hear what you guys think. Because these are short texts and these are not, complicated, long, these are not as complicated as some of her essays. I'm hoping today we have a chance for you guys to talk. So I look forward to that. So let me give you 2 examples and then hear what you guys have to say. So one is just the Arendt Center conferences. I know many of you have been to them. We have them every year. The next one's coming up in 3 weeks on October 11th and 12th. And the premise of the Arendt Center conferences are that we bring 20 to 25 smart people together on stage to talk about a particular issue. This year it's citizenship. What is citizenship and how does it relate to civil disobedience? And we bring people who are business people and lawyers and academics and activists and public intellectuals and artists. And that's a very important part of how I've conceived these conferences, which is we're not trying to present a single idea. And most of the people who come don't read Arendt or have read only a very little bit of Arendt. There's no attempt to say, here's the idea, here's the answer. It's to say, here's 20, 25 smart people who've thought about this problem, and let's begin a process of talking and thinking about it. And I have a very wonderful board at the Arendt Center. And one of the things they're always telling me is, you have to come up with answers. You know, no one wants to come to a conference and not have a conclusion, and you should have a report at the end where you sort of say, here's what we think. Here's how we move forward. And what I've said to them is the Arendt Center is a unique institution. It's a center, a humanities center that does politics, and a politics center that goes through humanities, but we don't do policy. We're not trying to come up with answers. We're trying to deepen the question. And the hope is that by talking about this, there will be a kind of joy and excitement, and people will begin to act, behave, do things differently. And in doing things and acting differently, they'll begin the process of changing the world. But we will never tell them how to do so. And that has always been my understanding of how Arendt thinks in the world. She writes in ways that makes you think. She never tells you what you should do. She never gives you an ideology. She never tells you, here are the rules. She doesn't think we can. And reading these essays, which none of these essays I'd ever read before, it was a real, I found it very confirming and wonderful, because I think it's what we're trying to do with the Arendt Center. One other example is that about 5 years ago, I started a series of seminars at Bard called The Courage to Be. And the premise of these Courage to Be seminars is we get 4 or 5 different professors around the college, each teaching a course on moral and political courage from their own viewpoints, their own disciplines. And we have common lectures and dinners and discussions about moral courage. And one of the things that in my teaching in these courses, I always thematize and tell the students is, will taking a course on moral and political courage make you more courageous? And it's the question that usually ends up being the final exam, right? You know, I talk about it all semester. In the end, I say, all right, in what ways or not has this course made you more or less courageous in your everyday life and in politics and ethics? And I think it's a fascinating question, because we're not telling them what courage is, although we read 25 or 30 different definitions of courage throughout the semester. And we're not saying, here's how a courageous person acts, because we read 25 or different people who disagree. But the premise of the course, at least in my mind, and again, I think it's an open question, and Bob asked, does this hold water? And I think that's the question, is that by thinking about moral and political courage and reflecting on it, most of them, or some of them, will begin to be critical of themselves when they're not courageous, and thus begin to act more courageously. And I will tell you that since I've been teaching that course, I feel that's happened to me. Not that I know what courage is, but I've been more willing to stand up on principle, to do what Hannah Arendt says thinking is, which is to try and be true to myself, and be willing to take the consequences of that. And so that to me is an example of, I think 2 examples, the conference and why people love it so much, and these courage courses are to me examples that what she's saying holds some water, Bob. It's not a bucket with holes in it. I'm not saying it's going to change the world today, even tomorrow or in 10 years. I mean, she doesn't say this. This is me, but I think this is a process of generations and maybe centuries. But it took 2,000 years for the Western moral tradition to solidify, and it took 200 years, more or less, for it to fall apart. I think it would be somewhat foolhardy to expect that we're going to recreate it in a couple decades. So I'd love to hear what people think, because I think Bob's question, does it hold water? I think it's a good question. So I'd love to hear what people think.
Can I jump in? This is
Go for it.
all right. For me, the biggest example is the women's consciousness raising groups from the 70s, where women were gathering in small groups and talking to each other, and I think it made enormous changes in our own lives and in the society. So I do think it works.
Great. I think that's a great example, and interesting. Arendt sort of died just before that really happened, and she doesn't talk much about it. But I think it's a great example of a way that consciousness raising and talking can change behavior in ways that over time change standards. I mean, we're 50 years past that, Susan, you know this, and we're still, the last year has been another exercise in changing the standards of how we view sexuality and sexual relations, intersexual relation. But it happens, and it happens slowly. And I take that as a positive.
We saw it in the area that I was. We saw it as something that was always going to be ongoing. And I think there were groups like Now, which saw it as 6 weeks of consciousness raising, and then you went on to bigger and better things in action. And that is not how we saw it. And so I think that what we're seeing is absolutely that it needs to be constantly going on, because there's always new levels and new issues and new areas to have to figure it out, and figuring it out collectively, as Arendt talks about. And I don't know that she would have, quote, approved of the consciousness raising, but I think we were figuring things out collectively in a way that, to me, speaks to a lot of what she talks about.
Great. Robert, I assume you want to chime in or not?
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah. Of course, I don't want to say this is not true. Of course, I want to believe it, otherwise it wouldn't be on this line. But there are counter examples which I sent to you. For example, in Germany, there were major theologians in Germany, among the most famous in the world during Hitler's time, and three of them I cited there: Hirsch and Althaus, I think his name is, and another one, Gerhard Kittel. And so these are three major theologians who were very much into talking, speaking, into the Bible, into teaching literature, and they all enthusiastically embraced Hitler. So I just want to mention that just because we sort of have a place where we can speak our minds and other people can speak their minds, doesn't mean that we're going to come to a place where we hope to come to. We can go the other way. I really like the women's movement, but it's also possible that we would have another kind of movement. And the other example is the internet. People get on the internet and have intense conversations. They don't test their opinions. They don't reality test them, and people just get more and more intense about their opinions because they talk to each other, people who agree with them. I think these are problems.
Absolutely, and I think I think there are a number of things in what you said that we need to confront, and I'd like to. One is the internet, and it's not just the internet, but something that we should take a look at is on page 441. in her essay Values in Contemporary Society. Now remember, this is a discussion that she's having with a number of people who you probably know, Paul Freund, Irving Kristol, and Hans Morgenthau, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. Again, asking the question of how do we resurrect values. And she says a lot of interesting things. We should probably come back to some of them, but on 441, she said she's asked by Thompson, the man moderating the talk, Kenneth Thompson, where would you talk? You mean talk as we are talking now around a table? Do you mean a national forum? Do you mean a televised programs? And she says, no, 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 exclamation point, not television. Only people who are directly concerned, not a news conference. On the contrary, the moment you speak for an audience, everything changes. You speak to your peers around a table. And I think this is exceptionally important in our understanding of what she has in mind. This cannot happen through presenting ideas in a wide audience. It cannot happen by teaching people what to believe, in a public forum. It can only happen with peers around a table. Now, that can be really optimistic because that's great, talking peers around a table. But it can really be pessimistic because, that's going to take a long time. And she says on the next page in response to Bill Kristol, Bill Kristol says, well, that's one teacher can produce 6 serious thinkers. If he's lucky in a lifetime, that's a lot. 5 teachers can produce 30. One has to assume that this is for the good. And I think she would agree with Bill Kristol in that calculation, which is why we're back to the generations and centuries. One of the problems we have today is that so many people believe the internet is a force for having public conversations. I have sort of hemmed and hawed on this a little bit over the last 15 or 20 years and generally been skeptical, but been open. As you guys all know, the Arendt Center has internet presence. We have a Facebook presence and all these other things, Twitter. But we're very careful on it. We sort of mostly use it to point people to our longer essays and conversations and videos. And the last 6 months have convinced me completely, as much as I can be convinced, that having public conversations on the internet is a disaster. Whether it's what happened to my friend Ian Baruma this week, being fired from the New York Review of Books or forced to resign from the New York Review of Books for publishing an article which was trying to initiate a conversation. People talking on the internet perform, join mobs. They don't, and people want to say, oh, you can have a real conversation, you can link, you can have like a thread and make points. But the point is, it's always for a public. You're always performing. It's, whether you're seeking, what's it called? Signaling your virtue is what the new term is. Virtue signaling. Whatever it is, I don't believe the internet is a place you can or should engage in serious conversation. So, I have a policy of people ask me questions or stuff on Twitter or Facebook. If I want to, I'll answer them offline, but I won't answer them online. I've just become convinced it's a disaster. I'm happy to have people tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think it works. And I think, so one point you said, Bob, the internet, I just wanted to put that out there. I think that's a real, unfortunately, a dead end. Your other point about the fact that not all talking is good and not all movements are good is absolutely right. And we talked about this last week for those of you who were on the call. There's no guarantees here that in a world without boundaries, in a world that's lost its guides, that all the talking is going to go in the right direction. And it's very likely that at times it will go in the wrong direction. And you can either accept that and work as hard as you can to teach as many people you can and think with people as you can to try and create a world where more people rather than less will go to what you believe to be the good. Or you can say, well, I don't want to trust that. I want to brainwash people to do what I think is right and seek to ideologically convince them. And that's what she considers to be really dangerous. So those are two thoughts on your thoughts. I'm happy to hear other people or you respond to them. Anyone else want to join in?
I just want to say I totally agree with you that this sort of thing can happen in small groups where people can see each other and form relationships and then be responsible for what they say. And it's a good way to test it out because you can say things and you think this is what I think, and then you can be challenged by a person you respect and you know who they are. That's really important, I think, to make progress, or maybe not progress, but just to be responsible in your speaking.
Yeah. I have a comment.
Yeah.
My comment is that I'm on a town council here in my town, and I'm in my third term, and we have a new council member, and I'm on the executive committee. So we set the agenda for each month. And this new person wanted to start a listserv for the whole town council so that we could continue discussions. And I totally put my foot down about it. I said, forget it. You've got people on this council who are all very different. Some don't know email etiquette. I'll put that one in quotes. You're going to get other people that are going to get very upset. And then what you do, what drops out, is that essential part of a town council, which is face-to-face communication. And that's how we move forward because we're all so different. We're not the same type of people. So, and she was shocked to hear that. And she wants to table it for next time, so I'm going to have to double down. Anyway, that's my comment about that type of discussion.
Well, you can cite values in contemporary society if you'd like.
I will do that.
And maybe have her read it. It's only 4 or 5 pages.
Okay, I'll do it.
You know, I mean, just to talk a little bit self-reflexively, when we started this virtual reading group, it was around the time, I'm sure some of you remember this, about 4 or 5 years ago when we started, that everyone was talking about MOOCs, massive online courses or something. And the idea of MOOCs was that you'd have
massive open.
Thank you, Connell. Massive open.
Yeah, I used to talk about them too. I'd forgotten about them.
Yes, and so, I was brought into a discussion at Bard College where I teach, saying, what should we do? And, our first reaction was clearly we're not going to involve ourselves in MOOCs. We're a small liberal arts college. In fact, we sort of said we're the anti-MOOC college, and, we're going to double down on being the place where people come and have small classes and small seminars and talk. And in fact, as a lot of big colleges maybe are put under pressure by MOOCs, we think there'll be more demand for a small liberal arts college like Bard. But it was then that I said, all right, well, I don't want to do MOOCs. I don't want to do this thing where you create lectures and you send them out and people answer questions. But I thought, is there a way to use technology where you could, in a sense, try and model the Bard experience? And that was when I started asking these questions, I was made aware of Blue Jeans, and we've been trying this for the last 4 years. And some of you have been there almost every week for the last 4 years, and I really give you great credit for that, and I thank you for it. But this is in a sense an experiment in whether you can have what Hannah Arendt says is a couple of peers around the table, or a small seminar with slightly more people all around the world joining in and having a collective conversation over now 4 years. I don't know. Obviously, some of you think it works. You're coming back, and I appreciate that. But it's something we should all think about. To what extent can the internet work in that way? One of the things I like about Blue Jeans is I can see you when you speak, unless you're on a phone or whatever. but we get to know each other. Any other thoughts about anything we said, or should I go on to the next question?
I wanted to mention back last week we talked about freedom and the downside of freedom. You can have bad things happen. But I want to get back to that word that you brought up at the beginning of that session, the miracles part. So when people are acting, sometimes you get the bad and sometimes you get the miracles. And I thought that was the second thing I wanted to say is face-to-face discussion lets you cultivate things where you don't have an immediate answer. You don't have, if somebody brings up something you hadn't thought about, you can, and then sort of cultivating the soil as to what might be something you can work out. When I hear Jennifer talking about being on a council, a trustee, that's sort of, I'm assuming that comes up all the time. You bring up something and you get in the next meeting and the next meeting until somebody comes to affirm, everybody or somebody comes to affirm a conclusion about it. That's what I thought. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I mean, I think miracles happen in different ways, and in the freedom essay we were talking about, miracles happen when you act in public in ways that people pay attention to. And so those kind of actions have to be in public. They have to be seen and heard within a structure where people can see and hear them and respond to them. The kind of talking that Arendt is talking about in these essays is thinking. And thinking is not a public act usually. It's an act that happens in solitude, or at least in small groups, or around a table of peers. The one exception to that, which she mentions, is in a time of crises, a real crisis like a Holocaust or a genocide of sorts. Those who think and withdraw and pull back from action and do so in a public way of pulling back become conspicuous in their non-action and in their thinking, and therefore can make other people stop and think as well. Are there any other comments, or should I go on?
I have a question. This is Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
I guess I keep getting hung up on, and this sort of ties in with the internet example. You know, it's thrown about a lot, the idea that, well, we all in this country generally, and the internet helps us to stay in our particular bubbles, our particular silos. And I find there's something sort of, she's talking about, you know, peers sitting around a table. Well, there are a lot of implicit assumptions in that to make that work, to make that move forward. I mean, to be, you know, sort of graphic. I mean, if you had, I don't know, Erdogan and Duterte and Putin and Trump sit at a table, are we really going to assume that totalitarianism, communism, and appeasement have become negative absolutes of behavior? I mean, so some of these assumptions that, you know, we know what's the negative absolute. Well, that goes for some, but I don't know. I don't see how that's generalizable, and I don't see how this works unless all the people in the peer-to-peer contact are actively engaging in actual thought. You know, we could all just get together and ratify each other, but that's one of the commonplace criticisms of our online universe anyway. So I'm that's got me turned around. I don't know how to come out there.
It's an excellent point, and good, and thank you, Margaret.
Can I say something too?
Yeah, I'll hold my thought. You go, Daphne.
It's sort of along what Margaret was saying. I think that one of the I didn't realize we had a change in schedule, so I haven't read these articles. But one of the things I was thinking about is that pretty much all revolutions and all sort of ethical stances that we take are in response to something that's going on. And I just recently read an article that said that one of the problems in the opposition to Trump today is that the Democrats have no positive position, that we don't know really what they stand for except that they're against. And I find that, isn't that sort of normal that we would react to a situation that's outrageous, or that we, like totalitarianism, like fascism, but really not necessarily have enough to then say, and this is the positive stance that we're taking, and would we be heard even if we are sitting at a table full of peers who then go on to reproduce our objection to what exists in the present. I teach a course on, right now I'm teaching a course on the underbelly of capitalism, which is inequality. And this is in a seniors college, so anyone over 50 can come. And normal classes are about 30 people. I have 117 that want to get in. I think people are really interested right now in the concept of inequality, but we can sit there and not come up with a positive solution to the problem. Maybe we can analyze the problem and support each other, just like Margaret was saying. You know, we're all part of this objection to what is, without necessarily having something as an alternative. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. These are good points, and I'll start with where I'll come back to where I started with, is that we're not seeking per se answers here. But I'll say a few things that what Margaret and Daphne made me think about. Margaret said that, you know, who's at the table? It matters. And that's true. I guess one thing I want to say about that is I'm not sure what Margaret and Daphne and I, to the extent we agree, which I don't know about, I'm not sure that our new standards and morals will be the one that becomes the new standards and morals of the next age. I don't particularly think it will be Trump's or Putin's either, but I also don't think it will be ours per se. I think it's wildly hubristic to think that what we believe will emerge, or what was believed by the Judeo-Christian Muslim world will emerge and reemerge. I think it's far more likely that some new moral universe will emerge that we have not yet thought, and that will be developed gradually over many years. The question of whether I think that's good or not, or whether I'm, I think it's okay, is somewhat moot. But I actually think it is. I think that I think that we want a new world to emerge that has truths that over centuries become widely embraced, loved, and accepted. The fact that they may not be the same ones we chose, I don't think is that important. Now, does that mean that there's a chance they will become dark, Hitlerian, Nazi, racist truths? Possible, but I doubt it. I generally believe that, human beings want to, if you have a wide swath of human beings, they want to create a world that is respectful to some degree. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to that, and who knows? But part of what I think Arendt is asking us to confront and live with is a world of without banisters, a world where we don't have these truths. And our attempts to say, well, it has to be our truths, is one that doesn't accept that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for our truths. I think we should, but we should realize that for most of us, our truths are partial and are probably not going to end up being what comes out at the end, whenever this end is. But that doesn't mean we should think, therefore we shouldn't fight for our truths. That's what I wanted to say about that. On the question of inequality, I think, what Daphne's saying is absolutely right. Inequality is one of those things that many people are aware of, upset about, and willing to fight for. And that's I think, a hopeful thing. Will that mean that equality is the new verity of whatever might come in a future? No, it doesn't. I don't know what will come. But I think the unacceptability of deep, rampant inequality is something that people share and will be part of that on upcoming world.
Okay, Roger, this is the other Bob.
Hi, Bob.
When you talk about,
excuse me, one sec. Could everyone who's not speaking turn their mics off so we don't get that kind of echo?
it could be me, I don't know. Anyway, when you speak of Arendt talking about not having banisters, she's obviously referring to the tradition as she understands it of Western European thought and beliefs. But nevertheless, she had some banisters. I mean, she doesn't come at any of this without principles. One of her principles is to think. We have to think. Another is she has a regard for humanity, which is why she condemns Eichmann to capital punishment. And certainly there are others. So how do you distinguish between her banisters and the banisters that we should not rely upon?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I mean, I think there's a difference between public banisters that are valid publicly for a plurality of people and our own private or individual or familial banisters. No one of us, and this brings up back to the possessed, which we should probably get to soon, her review of the possessed, but none of us, she thinks, can fully live completely without any beliefs. But that doesn't mean that we can impose or we should expect other people to share our beliefs. That's just the world we live in without public, another way to put it is we live in a world without banisters. That doesn't mean that any of us don't have banisters. I mean, all of us have to have a history, have things we've been taught. I hope most of us have some sense of who we are. And that's important, and we couldn't live without that. But that's different from saying that you and I share the same sense of who we are because we're both Athenians, or we're both Venetians, or we're both Jews, or we're both Muslims. And therefore we have certain things that we share and that are publicly, connect us to certain guidelines and banisters. That's what she thinks has fallen away.
Roger, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
It's Sam. I don't think that's quite what she means by banisters. For her, banisters are, it's not that, we come from different communities and different places and these give us things that we can hold on to. I think she would talk about those things as values that we might have. And certainly our values, which change over time, influence the way that we think. But when she's using that metaphor, it's very much a metaphor for a way of thinking without the traditional concepts and categories that guide our thought, right? And contained within that metaphor is the idea that we have to begin over again, over and over and over. She compares thinking to the activity of walking up and down a staircase without having any banisters to hold on to, and this kind of continuous mulling over. So part of it is what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, that with the appearance of totalitarianism in the 20th century, those traditional moral categories of good and bad were completely exploded. We can't rely upon the normative moral